Welcome to Arab Center, Washington, D.C., 4th Annual Conference entitled Media and Democracy in the Arab World, the Future of Freedoms and Rights in the Digital Age. My name, for those of you I have not met yet, most of you in the room, I can tell, are friends that I've met before, but for the sake of the others, my name is Khalil Jahshan, and I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington. We're very honored today to have convened with us a distinguished group of academics and practitioners who have come together from diverse perspectives and experiences and even geographical locales. I can see people already in the room, and others are joining us later who have come from Europe and from as far as the Middle East also. We've come together to examine the dynamics shaping freedom of expression and cyber geopolitics in the Arab world today. While social media tools and communication technologies have played a central role in uprising and democracy, uprising for seeking democracy, they have also become effective and unfortunately repressive tools of choice in the hands of the repressive authoritarian regimes that seem to be resisting back throughout the region. If I were to summarize the state of affairs with regards to media and freedom of the press in the Middle East in general and the Arab world in particular, I would have to say in the tradition of State of the Union exercises in this town, most of them are futile, but I'll try to be a little bit more useful than that by saying that the state of affairs with regards to media and freedom of expression in the Middle East is not well today as we speak. The reason I say that, because it is our belief, not just personal, but as a center that focuses on research on the region where the issues of human rights and freedom of expression particularly are important to us. When we look at for example, media freedom in the Middle East today, and we see that 3 of the top 4 countries, for example, in jailing journalists today are from the region, namely Turkey, Egypt, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. When I look at the most recent report from Reporters Without Borders, their ranking known as the World Press Freedom Index for 2019, comparing 180 countries in this respect and scoring them, most of the Arab world fits in the bottom 20 of the 180 list. Actually, 10 Arab countries are way down in the bottom of that list. Only 3 Arab countries fit made it in the top 100, and 0 made it to the top 50 on that list. So it's very dismal. The only 3 that made it in the top 100 are Comoros and Mauritania and Tunisia, which shows the link, I guess, in terms of Tunisia, between yearning for democracy and an increase in freedom of expression. There is a session today at noon that will be dealing with the issue of the Khashoggi murder. As you will know, Jamal Khashoggi was a friend personally and a friend of the center, and he spoke from this podium for the center before. And it is kind of fascinating. I couldn't help but think in preparing for this conference, his last article, the last essay that he wrote for the Washington Post, in which he said, most of the people living in Arab countries are either uninformed or misinformed on political events. They are unable to adequately address, much less publicly discuss, matters that affect the region and their day-to-day lives. He concluded, a state-run narrative dominates the public psyche, and while many do not believe it, a large majority of the population falls victim to this false narrative, end of quote. I think it is quotes like this and analysis like this that probably cost him his life, which is very regretful, but we will be talking about that later in the program. So currently, when you look around the region and you see events, particularly the last few weeks in Lebanon and Iraq and other countries, the Arab world finds itself facing a renewed wave of protests seeking potentially a democratizing outcome in the region. Of course, this is juxtaposed with the robust form of totalitarian rule, including increased targeting of journalists and activists in spite of these upheavals, or maybe due to these upheavals. It is against this backdrop, and with the knowledge and hope that the future of democracy and human rights in the Arab world will be significantly impacted by the uses of new media tools and technologies in the political and geopolitical spheres, that we have dedicated this fourth annual conference at the center to explore the role of the media and new technologies in advancing human rights and democracy in the Arab world. So on behalf of our colleagues at Arab Center worldwide, our colleagues in Doha, our colleagues in Beirut, our colleagues in Paris and in Tunisia, our board of directors here locally in Washington, and my colleagues, our staff at the Washington office, and myself, please allow me at this time to welcome you to this event and express my personal pleasure that you have chosen to be here to engage with us and with your colleagues on the program, with one another on this very critical topic. We hope that you will find the program and the discussions throughout the day today insightful, thought-provoking, and most importantly, of practical use applicable, because we do not want to focus just on the diagnosis. I mean, in looking around the room, I see experts in the region all over the place in different fields of specialties, but we would like to hopefully by the end of the day come up with some practical ideas on how to enhance the media and democracy, freedom of expression in the region. Before introducing our keynote speaker this morning, let me please announce a couple of announcements, housekeeping matters that would appreciate your cooperation in this regard. First of all, your questions are solicited and welcome throughout the day. There will be Q&A sessions every panel throughout the day. However, our tradition at Arab Center is to do that in writing, so that's why there are cards in front of you and pens or pencils to do that. If you have a question particularly or a short comment to make, please clearly indicate your name, affiliation, and ask your question, address it to the speaker or to panelists in later session, panelists of your choice. They will be collected. Once you have a question, just raise the card. Staff will pick it up and bring it forward, and I will be more than delighted to read it on one condition, that I can read it. So make sure I do function in several languages, but hieroglyphics is not one of them, so do not try that on me, otherwise your question will be ignored. Second one, the conference hashtags on Twitter are hashtag Arab Center 2019 and hashtag Arab Media. Please follow and join the conversation online. And finally, please help us to minimize any disruption by silencing your phones during all sessions today, starting now. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a genuine honor for me to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, who is uniquely qualified to speak on this issue of freedom of expression, both actually in the Middle East as well as here in the United States. Marc Lamont Hill is an award-winning journalist, professor of media studies, and a leading intellectual voice in the United States. Dr. Hill has been a nationally renowned social justice activist an organizer for most of his professional life. He has authored and co-authored many publications and edited several books, and has received numerous prestigious awards for his work, including being named by Ebony magazine as one of America's 100 most influential black leaders. Marc is actually trained as an anthropologist of education. He holds a PhD degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and his research throughout his academic career has focused on the intersection between culture, politics, and education in the United States and beyond, including the Middle East. More detailed bio is available in your program book. I will not take your time or take his time from speaking to say more things. I do have more things to say about him, but please join me at this time in welcoming Marc Lamont Hill.
Thank you, Khalid. Good morning, everyone. It is, excuse my voice. The Nationals won the World Series last night. So, as a Philadelphian, I spent the night booing, so I'm a little, Bryce Harper and I. It is a real honor to be here this morning with you, to have the opportunity to talk and think about such a significant issue, such an important question, thank you, of freedom of speech and the broader conversation around democracy in the media. As a professor of media studies and as someone who thinks deeply about the media, I think that we all have the grandest aspirations, the grandest hopes. We assign our deepest expectations of democratic possibility to the media. That is to say that any vision we have of equality or of justice or of freedom or of democracy, we attach it to some extent, the media. We believe that the more robust a media sphere we have, the more diverse a media we have, the more capable a media we have, the more unrestricted a media we have, the more likely we will have access to all the spoils of democratic citizenship. If we can simply tell our truths, if we can hold power accountable, if we can investigate, if we can locate solutions, we can only expand on democratic possibilities, not just here, but around the globe. And that is why the numbers of countries, of nation states, of communities that have media landscapes that are the opposite of that is so depressing. When Khalil talks about Turkey or Egypt or, of course, Saudi, it can become alarming, jarring even to our minds and our democratic sensibilities to understand that there are countries where freedom of speech, critique of the government, et cetera, is completely unrestricted, or excuse me, completely restricted. But sometimes you have to return home. It's easy to look at a CC government or, for all intents and purposes, an MBS government and say, look how unfree they are. Look at the lack of freedom there. But to not be critically and self-reflective of the ways in which the United States also forecloses on democratic possibilities through the media. Now, one difference when we talk about the United States is that the freedom of expression is a constitutional affordance. It's something that we all have access to in theory. There is, however, a gap as a matter of practice oftentimes between what freedom is supposed to be and what freedom looks like. Freedom isn't just constrained through repressive state apparatuses. That is to say, freedom isn't just restrained by an army or a navy. It's not always a machine gun or a police baton that prevents us from speaking our truths. It's not always a prison cell that is the thing that discourages us from being able to articulate powerful truths against the powerful. Sometimes our freedom of expression is restricted through those means, to be sure. We've seen that with reporters who have been jailed here in the United States, but it's also restrained by far more pragmatic and practical matters. Sometimes we don't speak truths because of the consequences of speaking truths. It's sort of easy to critique the Trump administration now. There's no shortage of Trump critics right now on any side of the aisle. I'm not even sure that it's a partisan matter to be critical of Donald Trump. But there are moments over the last 2 or 3 years where critiques of Trump have been quite partisan, and where there are moments where it was much more easy to critique Trump on policy matters versus personal matters. There are moments where it's possible to highlight or celebrate a particular candidate or ignore another one. The political landscape shifts from time to time, and the political but also professional consequences of articulating particular critiques or covering certain campaigns or exposing certain scandals have different consequences, and we have to be honest about that. And there are also ways that our freedom of expression is restricted or constrained at a much more deep level. The academic in me wants to talk about the discursive limits of freedom of speech. The way in which our frames of knowledge and our frames of reference foreclose on the possibility that we could even consider other outcomes, that we could even offer other analyses, that we could even decide whether a story matters or not. I mean, that's part of the challenge of what freedom of expression means, is that sometimes it gets so limited and constrained at the intellectual level that we don't even consider putting something as a lead on our television broadcast, or we don't allow something to be a headline in a newspaper, not because anyone is standing there saying, hey, you can't talk about this particular bombing over here, but you can talk about that bombing over there. It's because we've already been constrained in such a way, intellectually, politically, and professionally, that we don't even consider it. But the Middle East, because I've been speaking in sort of general terms, but the Middle East, that is particularly challenging. Particularly vexing for anyone interested in media to think about how these freedoms of expression are limited. For me, my story comes, you might have heard of it. I used to work at a place, cable news network, that's the name of it, and I gave a speech at the United Nations about almost a year ago. And after I spoke at the UN on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, and I gave a 24-ish minute speech talking about the conditions on the ground in Israel, Palestine. I am a trained anthropologist. I have spent years now on the ground in the region. I specifically study race and identity and citizenship in Palestine. And I specifically spend most of my time in Jerusalem, but a significant amount of time in other parts of the West Bank as well, specifically Ramallah and Khalil. I'm also an activist. I also have led delegations there. I have spent a significant amount of time studying the issue, and I was brought to the UN actually as a representative of civil society to talk about what I saw on the ground. I didn't expect it to be a controversial matter. Certainly didn't expect to get fired the next day. Would have made some different choices, you know. But not about the speech, about other things, you know. Wouldn't have gotten the MBA package, you know. but I gave a speech, and at the end of the speech, there was much controversy, apparently, about 6 words in the speech that people found objectionable. Not the substantive critique of human rights, not the critique of the court system, not the talk about settlement expansion, not the analysis of the violation of human rights on the ground. None of that was called into question. My appeal to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of established in 1948, and the comparison of the conditions on the ground to those universally declared human rights, none of that was called into question. And so I was a bit surprised the next day when I got a phone call that I could no longer work for this cable news network because the words of my speech were not in line with their values. This is the exact quote. Your speech was not in line with our values. Which values? Seemed like a reasonable follow-up. All of them. This is a bizarre conversation. The most bizarre conversation I've ever had in my life. Just all of them. Well, which part of the speech? Because I'm assuming they're talking about the last 6 words of the speech where I said free Palestine from the river to the sea, which for them was I'll get into this a little bit, what they considered to be an anti-Semitic remark. That the appeal to calling for a free Palestine from the river to the sea was anti-Semitic because it was calling to remove Jewish people from the land, and or it was seen as a subtle allusion to Hamas. And so by saying free Palestine from the river to the sea, I was tacitly or maybe explicitly supporting Hamas, and because they believe that Hamas is a terrorist organization, I am therefore a terrorist of sorts, at least rhetorically, and as such, I do not belong on the network. Now, they didn't say all of that. They just said your speech isn't in line with our values, and they refused to comment further. The conversation ended, and the last 11 months have proceeded in really interesting and bizarre ways. And for me, that was an interesting moment to give a speech to give remarks off air as a private citizen, to offer a political analysis and a political critique, but to be not allowed on the air because the particular formation of my politics was out of step with what they wanted me to do, out of step with a particular type of orthodoxy, for me was problematic and certainly a violation of free speech. Now, I would concede that, of course, if I owned a cable news network and someone were anti-Semitic, I would not want them on my network. I would not allow them on my network. There's no part of my political analysis, no part of my moral or ethical vocabulary, there's no part of my personal makeup that advocates or supports anti-Semitism. I reject anti-Semitism at all turns, at all times, and in all ways. But that's where substance has to come into the conversation, right? It's not enough to simply say that something is anti-Semitic. We have to be willing to question whether something is anti-Semitic. And I would suggest to them, if we had the benefit of a conversation, that river to the sea is a conversation that has been existing in historic Palestine for over a century, that the language of rivers to seas is not exclusive to Hamas, which is a relatively, in the scope of human history, new organization, that the Likud party, for example, in their platform statement in the 70s, talked about the river to the sea, that there are liberal parties, there are radical parties on both sides, there are Zionist organizations, political parties, there are progressive or even radical pro-Palestinian organizations that all use the language of river to the sea. If you spend any time in the region, you will hear the words river and sea in that very context across the political landscape. But even the idea that Hamas somehow now has exclusive rights to that phrase is itself an outgrowth of a lack of area knowledge, a lack of close analysis, and a deep commitment to preventing any type of complicated conversation about this in the media, which itself is a certain type of restriction of freedom of speech. I don't want to talk to you this morning about my personal case. I'm okay. But I do think that there has to be space and time and intellectual room for a conversation about freedom of expression on this issue. What I want to talk about this morning, though, is some of the things that I think are preventing it. One thing is, and I wish it weren't this simple, it's racism. And I mean racism in the most broad way possible. We could be more specific and use the language of Orientalism. Sadly, the East, and in this case more specifically the Middle East, continues to be constructed in ways that define it as the moral, ethical, intellectual, and civilizational opposite of the West. We continue in news media too often to frame the Middle East as a space of anti-democracy, incomplete democracy, a lack of civilization, and flat-out barbarism. How many times do we watch mainstream media or listen to mainstream media talking points or political talking points where the politician says, this is an intractable battle? We heard y'all's president, somebody's president, probably nobody in this room, speaking just last week, we got to get out of there because they've been fighting forever. The discourse of they've been fighting forever, whether we're talking about Palestine, whether we're talking about Syria, whether we're talking about Iran, this language of they have been fighting forever simply reinforces the idea that there is a lack of possibility or capacity among Arab communities to engage in forms of peace. That there's never been a moment of stability or peace or nation building, that the decades of Arab nationalism, that the centuries of peace that have existed all throughout human history, but certainly within the modern era, are all to be ignored. This is a particular narrative. That narrative makes it very easy to not have a complicated or nuanced conversation about the Middle East. It forecloses on possibilities of expression at the discursive level because we don't even imagine the Middle East as a space of human agency, of a space of democratic possibility, of a space of freedom. But this is itself is a part of another issue, which is, again, a lack of area knowledge. It's absolutely stunning to sit in media newsrooms, and to sit in media newsrooms, whether it's television media, whether it's print media, and hear the lack of basic fundamental understandings of the issues that are at stake. Whether it's a news anchor, and I'm be very clear, I'm not speaking of CNN right now. I'm speaking of every news outlet, most news outlets in America. I've learned to be very careful, or precise rather. But if you have news anchors that don't know the difference between Sunni and Shia, I mean, just basic fundamental things. If people don't understand the impact of major policy moments, major legislative shifts, major shifts in the organization of the world itself, it becomes very challenging to have any kind of conversation about the region. I was reading yesterday, there was an interview with Peter Jennings in 1975. And of course, Peter spent a great deal of time in Lebanon and actually was very well informed at the time, and he talked about the challenges in the newsroom of getting people to not call everybody Arabs. Meaning that knowing the difference between someone who was Lebanese and someone who was Syrian might be significant, that you can't just say there was a war in the Middle East and Arabs were fighting. Imagine that. And while we've certainly made progress from that moment, some progress from that moment, now we talk about specific groups of Arabs that are fighting. We still lack the level of nuance and political knowledge that we need in order to have a sophisticated conversation. And so when moments happen like the one at the UN, or when moments happen where there are debates on television, we don't have access to the type of information to adjudicate competing claims, to decide what's a legitimate argument and what is not, to be able to make a historically informed case for what is true and what is not true. We are simply unable to do that. Another issue is, and this is the nature particularly of news media today, is that there is little conversation about structure. There is little room to talk about institutions and structures. We're always in a moment of reaction. We're always in a moment where we are analyzing or responding to what has happened, to a particular conflict, to a particular policy moment, and we don't have, again, based partly on this lack of area knowledge, the ability to talk about the deeper and more fundamental structures that are in place that create the conditions for something to happen. What good is it to talk about an uprising in Gaza if we can't talk about what happened after the election of Hamas? How difficult is it to talk about the presence of Hamas if we can't talk about the conditions that created Hamas, if we can't talk about Oslo? What significance is it to the conversation about the West Bank if we don't talk about the Oslo Accords? How challenging is it to have a deep and fundamental analysis of Israel-Palestine, or of Saudi Arabia, or of any other country or circumstance or relationship or conflict in the Middle East if we don't understand formations of power, if we don't understand the relationship between the United States and the Middle East, if we don't understand the relations of power, if we don't understand the political economy of the Middle East, if we don't understand the role of the West in maintaining particular relations of power, these are all significant conversations that we are able to have with nuance and sophistication in the Middle East, in the West. We would never have a conversation in American news media about guns or gun control or about the Second Amendment and not have a conversation about the NRA. It would be absurd. It would be impossible to have a conversation about reproductive freedom and justice and not have an analysis of all of the groups, all the organizations, all the historical moments, all the major Supreme Court decisions that have shifted the conversation in one way or another. I'm not suggesting that on our 24-hour cable news cycle, we should be expecting major news anchors in the 30 seconds they have to be talking about the Balfour Declaration or the Hussein McMahon correspondences in great depth over 22 seconds. I ain't saying all that. But you should know what basic laws are. You should know that there are no established borders. You should know some fundamental stuff that informs the conversation. Because when you don't have that, you enter a moment that cable news in particular, but I would argue American media more broadly, loves to engage. And that is the next point. That is this obsession with parity, of saying there's one side over here and there's another side over there, and we're just going to debate it out. It makes for great TV. It makes for great debate. It's great on the blogs. But at some point, we have to have the intellectual and political honesty to say that all sides aren't created equal. I remember working at Huffington Post, and one of the great things that Ariana Huffington did was, she said, we are no longer going to have debates on climate change. Because to have a debate on climate change and to have the climate change denier over here and the person who believes in science over there, and to have them in a one-on-one debate is to legitimize a position that is not sustainable intellectually. It's dishonest. It makes for great TV. But it doesn't make for a more informed or intellectually responsible citizenry. Doesn't mean we silence voices that we don't agree with. But what it means is we have to hold them accountable to some sort of standard. But too often on the question of particularly Israel-Palestine, we say that these are two competing sides that have been fighting forever, and we're going to have one over here and one over there. And we ignore the fact that one is an occupying power. We ignore the fact that one is in violation of international law. And in doing so, we limit the possibilities of advancing the conversation. And those who attempt to intervene in that conversation in those ways, to hold power accountable wherever it is in the world, are professionally, socially, or intellectually marginalized. Their freedom of expression is limited. I've never gone on a cable news network. I've never written an article and been told you can't talk about this. I've never been told that I can't take the position that I want to take. There is no secret cabal of power. That would be a dangerous, and I would argue, anti-Semitic narrative. But there are intellectual limitations on the conversation that we have about the Middle East, not just Israel-Palestine, but about the Middle East. And we also have to be honest about that. We have to be honest about lobby groups. Again, there are no secret cabals of power, but there are lobby groups. There's lobby groups for guns, there's lobby groups for the anti-abortion movement, there are lobby groups on the question of Israel. And we have to be honest about the role that those organizations, those institutions, those particular belief systems play in how we have a conversation. It is no coincidence that when you debate somebody in the media on the question of gun control, they all have the same talking points. If you talk about school choice, they all have the same talking points. And certainly when I watch a Democratic debate and I hear Hillary Clinton, I'm talking about 2016, Hillary Clinton repeating the same AIPAC talking points that Donald Trump would eventually repeat after he got the memo, I then and again, when I say the memo, I mean literally Donald Trump received a memo the next day. The first day he was much more like, I'll be an arbiter of both sides. He said that he received a memo saying that he needed to be more stern and articulate his position on Israel differently, and he did. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump was influenced by power. I'm saying that may be Donald Trump's worldview. But what I'm saying is if we all have the same worldview and we all have the same talking points, then we can't have a robust conversation. There needs to be room for people with a different point of view and different talking points, and we have to be able to have that conversation on the public stage as well. But unfortunately, we don't have that. And some of it is our own commitment to the status quo and our refusal as politicians and as citizens and as journalists to indict or challenge the status quo. Many of us find social and political and even intellectual comfort in the arrangement of power whereby the United States exercises considerable control over the Middle East, where relations of capital continue to persist in the way that they do. We can, as a group of journalists or media people, be outraged at the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, but to what extent does that resonate with the broader public, and how can we change that conversation? How can we be willing to create a world where there isn't this type of fatigue? And lastly, there is considerable room within American media to talk about the reaction of the vulnerable. But there is very little room and space to critique the actions of the powerful. We'll talk about the Palestinian response. We'll talk about the Houthi response. But we must create room to have the initial analysis. We can have a critique of Hamas. Who doesn't have a critique of Hamas? Who doesn't have a critique of the Sultan? Who doesn't have a critique of the Palestinian Authority? These are legitimate critiques to have. You should. If we're being honest in the media, we have to have a critique of that. But I also need to have a critique of the conditions and the sets of institutional arrangements that and dynamics of power that created the occupation in the first place, that created dislocation and transfer and expulsion in the first place. That has to be the initial piece of the conversation that we have. I can't talk about the construction of the rebel as an idea and as an identity in the media if I don't talk about the role that Saudi might play or Bahrain might play in the construction or the violation of human rights. I can talk about the response that's happening in Lebanon, but what kind of institutional arrangements demand the response in Lebanon? I can talk to the response to Mubarak, but what creates the response? What creates the conditions that normalize and legitimize Hosni Mubarak in the first place before we get to the moment in Tahrir? How do we have this happen? What are the conditions that we are willing to produce on the ground as media and journalists to allow people to have a deeper and more thoughtful structural and institutional analysis of the world? There's no room for that. So if we close all the possibilities of substance and nuance and depth and historical analysis, and all we have are two people fighting, then sure, this does look like an intractable problem. This does look too messy for us Americans to get involved in. This does look like it's above us now. And those few people who want to speak in a different way are seen as extremists, as outside the boundaries of civil discourse. And so the language of civility and politeness become excuses, they become pretexts for shrinking democratic dialogue. It is our job as those who either work in media or work with media to constantly push and challenge to expand the conversation, to add intellectual depth and nuance, to demand multiple representations of different people, to demand that, and what I mean by that is to demand that we don't just talk about Palestinians or about Syrians or about Lebanese people, but that we have people speak for themselves, that we don't speak as proxies for those people, that we allow people on the ground from those countries, from those regions, to speak for themselves. It means that we allow multiple points of view, but we don't pretend that all points of view are created equal. It means that we no longer pretend to be objective adjudicators of truth. That's not to say that we're not fair. That doesn't mean that we're not balanced. It doesn't mean that we're not disciplined in our analysis. But what it means is we have to hold something accountable. We have to have a moral and ethical vocabulary that informs the work that we do. We have to prioritize and emphasize justice. We have to prioritize and emphasize democracy. And there are many ways to do that. In the ballot box, with our feet in the streets, with our voices, with our dollars. But there's also the media. This is our tool. The media is our weapon to expand truth and democracy and freedom and self-determination for everyone. But we have to be honest about the moment we're in. We have to be willing to roll up our sleeves and do the work to resist this moment and to create new possibilities for freedom and democracy. Thank you.
Okay, while we are waiting for some of your questions to make it up here to the podium, there are some on this side too. If we could have another staff member cover this side. Thank you, Marc, for your very honest and challenging presentation for all of us to do more on this front. And I would like to begin by asking you, looking at this issue, the fact that, and the changes that we have undergone, particularly here in Washington, in terms of the domineering nature of U.S. policy in the region, and it still continues to preach and not practice democracy and freedom of expression in the region. What do you see as is there still a constructive role for the United States in this regard of freedom of expression and media? Or has the U.S. deteriorated over the past 20, 30, 40 years to becoming totally part of the problem and not part of the solution?
That's a wonderful question. I would push back against just part of the premise of the question, which was that 30 or 40 years ago, the United States was better. I think obviously there are ways that right. I think that there's always been a challenge, I would argue post-World War II, of the United States playing a constructive and healthy role in the Middle East more broadly, but specifically with regard to media and media representation. But I think you're right. I think the last 30, 40 years has produced an even greater set of challenges in many ways. I think some of those challenges are countervailed by the new media technologies that you spoke about earlier, because at the very same time that we are forced into a fairly singular narrative about the Middle East, there's digital and social media that allow people on the ground to push back and to resist and to offer their own narratives and their own representations to counter-narrate what's happening. I didn't get the most profound understanding of what was happening on the ground in Egypt during the revolution from ABC or from CBS. I got it from Twitter. When I saw, before things were shut down, I got to see some interesting forms of resistance in Iran a few years ago. I'm watching what's happening in Lebanon, and I'm feeling excited from Instagram as much as I am from NBC. And so I'm not as pessimistic about this moment as I otherwise would be. That said, to the second part of your question, or maybe the first part, I think that the United States still does have the capacity to play a helpful role in the conversation around media and justice and democracy in the Middle East. I think it's about accountability. There are two things that we can do at the level of, not at the governmental level, but at the level of media institutions. We simply have to have a more robust conversation. That happens from investing in it. There's still the possibility, just like there is at any moment, of changing. There was a time where the networks were chasing down a missing airplane for 3 months, simply because it made for good TV. We have to, when white women go missing, we deploy all of our resources to finding them for months at a time on cable news because it makes for good TV. If we can do a better job of creating the appetite and the intellectual space to think about the Middle East in interesting and robust fashion, we could become obsessed with Lebanon. We could become obsessed with Syria. We could become obsessed with what, I mean, there was an incredible revolution, an incredible amount of beautiful resistance that we saw in Sudan just a few months ago, and to see 12 seconds of it on the media was super disappointing. And then at the governmental level, and I promise I'll answer these faster, there's also the question of accountability. The United States has the ability to hold Saudi Arabia accountable, even for the just bizarre and disturbing, tragic Jamal Khashoggi ordeal, murder. There's the ability to hold nation states accountable. We actually have the political and economic leverage to make those things happen. And so I'd like to see us exercise that. I think the possibility is there. Am I as optimistic about that as I am about the people? No.
Okay, thank you. The first question from the audience is from Daoud Kuttab. How specifically can we make media gatekeepers to engage with authentic voices out there?
I always laugh when I meet people who talk about giving voice to the voiceless. I always feel like there's a sense of self-importance that I want to give voice to the voiceless. Like I always say, like, don't give voice to the voiceless, just pass the mic. You know, there are moments where I remember in 2014 when the 51-day war began in Gaza. I began to be used on television. I would often be put into these debates with Alan Dershowitz. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I should. And it was an interesting set of exchanges, and it was fun, and it was cool. But after like day 3, I was like, wait a minute, this isn't fair. We can have authentic voices if I say no and pass the mic. If I say no, bring Noda Adakat on. No, bring whomever. I mean, it doesn't, you know, whoever you might want to pick. But bring Yusuf Munir in. Right? Bring in people who are on the ground doing this work who are Palestinian. That helps bring in an authentic voice. Now, authentic doesn't just mean being from the place, because you could be from the place and have bad politics. Zora Neale Hurston once said, all your skin folk ain't your kinfolk. So it's not enough to just have Palestinian voices if they're going to be on the wrong side of the issue. But I do think that's a start. Another thing is we have to vote with our feet. I mean, if we're having a conversation about the best way to get to a two-state solution, an authentic voice isn't just a Palestinian voice, it's a voice that says, wait a minute, what about other possibilities? What about a one-state solution? What about democratic? It should be part of the conversation. Whether you agree with the one-state solution or not, it should be part of the conversation. But we have to demand that. We have to say, I'm not going to watch this if you continue to have these types of representations. But unfortunately, because we don't have significant enough kind of mass investment in the issue, there's no one really pushing back on this.
The next question is from Jafari from Al Mayadeen Network. Amounts of money spent on U.S. media and trying to influence U.S. media by Arabs seem to be enormous these days.
Oh, yeah.
when we look back at other conflict areas and other cultures, like let's say the Vietnamese, they spent zero on trying to influence American media and opinion. Why were they successful in Arab Spring?
That's a great question. One, I wouldn't say that Arabs are entirely unsuccessful. That's the first thing I would stipulate. I think that we have seen an extraordinary pushback and resistance to some of the dominant narratives of the last 30 or 40 years in the Middle East. Some of that is about the investment of Arab lobbies. Some of it is just, quite frankly, people seeing it more. You know, when you watch what happened in Gaza in 2014, for example, when you could see the explosions and you could see the children, similar to the effect of the representations of the Vietnam War 50 years prior, it shifted American public sentiment. When you can see the impact of disproportionate force in a region, it makes things look and feel different. However, some of the unsuccess, the lack of success that the question speaks to goes back to the initial point I made, which is a question about we could talk about racism, we could talk about Orientalism, but at the core, it's a question of white supremacy, and it's a question of Western supremacy, and it ultimately becomes a question of whose lives and whose bodies matter. As Judith Butler talks about, who's worth mourning? Because if I don't see bodies as mournable, if I don't see bodies as worth saving or investing in or protecting, then I won't be outraged no matter how much attention I draw to it. So if I drop $1 billion to show you all of the devastating impacts of not having electricity or potable water or freedom of movement in Gaza, that's great. But if I fundamentally believe that these are barbaric subhuman beings, then it's much more difficult to produce empathy and moral outrage. We can show famines in Ethiopia or in Eritrea or in Somalia in the 80s and 90s. We can show that, but if I fundamentally don't believe that Africans are human beings, then no matter how much money I get to showing you the problem, I will never get the same type of outcome I will for that really nice missing white woman in Spokane, Washington. And the truth is, they all deserve our mourning. They all deserve our outrage. They all deserve our sympathy. But we don't get it partly because of that. And then thirdly, there are, at the same time that there are groups pushing and advancing a I don't want to speak broadly about Arabs because I think there's so much geographic and nation-state specificity we have to have when we talk about this issue. But the groups that are pushing to advance the types of agendas and types of politics you're asking about, I think there are also groups that are pushing back and countervailing that, which is very different. Like there was no pro-famine group, right? Like so it's a very different type of issue, and so I think it produces different types of challenges.
Yasser Ali from CAP asks, do you still believe, based on your experiences, in U.S. values, or are these just for media consumption?
U.S. values, that's always I don't even know what that means, you know? So if the question is, do I believe, okay, so there's so many levels to that question. This is why you don't ask professors questions. So do I believe in the values that the United States expresses for itself around democracy and freedom and independence? Yes, of course I believe in democracy and freedom and independence. Do I believe that those are quintessentially United States values? Of course not. We are a settler colonial nation state produced out of the dislocation and ultimately, honestly, the expulsion and really the genocide of indigenous populations here in the United States. We are a nation state that was built, whose economy was built on cotton through the exploited labor of enslaved Africans. And we have expanded the American empire through those means, both in Latin America and in Latin America and in Africa, and of course, in the post-World War II moment in the Middle East. So, do I believe in American values? No. Now, the last part of that is, do I believe in the ability of America to be something else? I don't know. I never lose hope. I believe that this nation has grown, it's developed. We are more free today than we were at a different moment in very material ways. As the great-grandchild of slaves, I have to say that. I'd be dishonest not to say that. But do I believe in the kind of American exceptionalist narratives that suggest that we can nurture and export democracy around the globe, that we can save, to use Gayatri Spivak's language, that we can go around the world and save brown women, that white men can go and save brown women from brown men? No. Do I believe that America has something unique and special to teach the world about freedom, justice, and equality? Of course not. But do I believe we can be better than we are at this moment? Absolutely.
You know, you just mentioned the term exceptionalism. How about the other use of that same word, as if like the region you've been discussing is somehow accepted from democracy and freedom of expression and so on, and it's hopeless to keep talking about that possibility.
Again, because we construct, and Saeed talked about this much more brilliantly than I ever could, but because we imagine democracy as a uniquely Western product, and that only we can produce this thing and expand it, that will always create these narratives that that the Arab world in particular is unready for civilization. It's unready for democracy. As an anthropologist, our discipline in many ways is founded on this premise that there are civilized nations and there are non-civilized nations. There are literate societies and illiterate societies, that there are modern societies and pre-modern societies. And too often we continue to construct and imagine the Middle East as a place that is pre-modern and therefore not ready for democracy because we don't believe, again, that they're fundamentally human. And so it's much more easy to create the exception, right? There's the exception for democracy, the exception for droning, the exception for freedom of movement, we love all that stuff till it's time to give it to people we don't want to give it to. And I think that the Middle East is not alone in that. I think if you were to look in Rwanda, or you were to go to Botswana right now, or you were to look at the effects of World Bank or IMF policy anywhere in the continent of Africa, you would see another place where we've decided that people aren't ready. The mandate period that exists in the Middle East, I'm making this point because the Middle East is the exception, but it's not the only exception. It's like it's brown people and black people are the exception, right? The mandate period that said that these nations aren't ready for post-World War I democracy extended into Southwest Africa. It extended into other places. So it's a very complicated but messy landscape until we dismantle and disrupt white supremacy, which is maybe the biggest of all tasks. We're always going to have these, and capitalism, of course, right? We're going to have these challenges.
Richard Coleman would like you to tell him, where do you draw the line? I mean, let's assume that there is a newsroom leader that decides to air a supporter of ISIS, for example, who argues about American hegemony that requires, or the only option required here is violent resistance.
That's tough. And of course, the ISIS question, it wasn't even like, okay. I'm already imagining the headlines, right? It's a good question. I think that there should be multiple criteria for deciding whether a voice is worth spotlighting. I think there's a legitimate argument that we don't want and we should not give voice to active terrorist organizations. I think I agree with that position. I don't think that's a controversial. I don't think that's a controversial position as such. I think the challenge is not, the question for me is less about ISIS. It's not whether we wanted Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi to be like on like AC 360, right? To me, that's the easy one to say no, right? But what happens when we say that a democratically elected organization like Hamas, which has a legitimate which is a legitimate part of the conversation, or the PLO? What would we have said in 1988, right, or 1987? We're in the middle, or we're at the beginning of an intifada, and they're saying, well, no, the PLO is a terrorist organization, and so we can't have a conversation with them. At what moment do we decide? So I think I think there are outliers that we can probably say, you know what, that's probably, we got to have a philosophical conversation about that, but I think we could agree that Boko Haram or ISIS may not be the people we want to interview for all sorts of practical and ethical reasons. But I do think that we can't say that just because someone has been deemed a terrorist by a state organization, right, The ANC, the African National Congress. I mean, Nelson Mandela's party was still a terrorist organization on our government's list during the Bush administration. Nelson Mandela technically couldn't travel. We allowed him. We made the exception for him, but we couldn't. But he couldn't. So I'm not willing to allow that to be the thing. The second piece of that is the question of violence. I don't think that we can. As I said many times, I think that I am pro-peace. I support nonviolent resistance. I support nonviolent movements. But international law, and I think good common sense says that people who are being physically harmed have the right to defend themselves. And I certainly would allow room for someone in the conversation to be able to talk about their belief in their right to defend themselves. I don't think that is an absurd. I mean, we allow people on the news that will talk about arming elementary school teachers after a school shooting. I think that is a far more extremist and absurd position than telling someone who is under the foot of imperialism in a particular nation anywhere in the world that they have the right to armed resistance. I think we should be able to have that conversation. So at the philosophical level, I'm saying drawing the line is never, I don't like to draw absolutes like no terrorists or no pro-violence, because I think that there's too much nuance in how those terms are constructed. Those are all socially constructed terms. And so if you grew up in the American Western media landscape and you hear Houthi rebels, you start freaking out. It's only when you start reading books that you realize who you're supposed to be banging with and who you're not. So for me, I never want to think in absolute terms, but to have those elements in the newsroom of historical understanding, of informed analysis, et cetera, that will get us to a place, where we can make reasonable and nuanced conversations about who should be in the conversation, but not. But if I have to err on a side, just to tie this all up, I would rather err on the side of a newsroom and a public sphere that is more inclusive rather than less inclusive.
All right, there are a lot of questions that could keep us here for another hour, I think. But for the sake of brevity and trying to include at least several questions at one time, let me try to reduce 2 or 3 of them to a yes or no.
Okay.
Steve from Anira is saying that there is an opening recently. There has been an opening in on the political side.
Yes.
In terms of discussion on Palestine.
Yeah.
Do you think one could expect a similar opening on the editorial or media part, being a little bit more flexible or dealing with issues that you delineated that are not discussable at this time?
I think so. I can't say a pure yes, but I'll give a short answer. Mm-hmm. I think yes. I think as the politics expand, as you see political, I mean, Bernie Sanders just this week talked about making funding to Israel contingent on the humanitarian conditions in Gaza. What should be a moral common sense, like a no-brainer, is actually a kind of a radical move in American politics. That type of expansion leads to a broader conversation on the editorial page, on TV, et cetera. So I think we're in the right direction. I think we're moving away from a singular narrative. I think things are getting better.
Safi Hamid from the Egyptian-American Relations Center is saying that their experience has been that the U.S. media seems to be like a closed fortress. Agree or not?
I'm really bad at saying yes or no to things like that because there's too much complexity.
Short answer.
I'm not sure exactly what he means. So a closed fortress in what way?
Very difficult to reach. I mean, this is typical of many in the Arab American communities.
Oh, yes.
As they try to work with the media.
I see. Yes, I think that's true. And I think that's a problem for many groups. I think two things. One, media outlets are particularly television media, which I can speak to more, is worried about what makes money. And so, and these stories, just because people don't care about Arab lives or Black lives or queer lives or trans lives, then we're not inherently going to cover it, right? And so they only cover it to the extent that it converges with their own interests. I think that's a significant challenge. And then the other challenge is, quite frankly, producers on television are risk averse. And they don't want to add new faces, the reason you see the same people on cable news every day is it's often, I don't want to call them lazy. I think people are afraid of bringing someone new on. And so you see the same people, you see the same challenges, you see the same issues, you see the same rundowns every day because it works. And nobody wants to be the person that introduces something that doesn't work. Because if you introduce something that doesn't work, then you might be unemployed. They'll take credit for it if it works, and they'll all hide if it doesn't work. And so this becomes the challenge. And so you see fewer brown and black faces, you see fewer brown and black topics, partly because of the money piece and partly because of the risk aversion. Verseness, maybe? Yeah.
Let's conclude with the following question from Alison Glick, Churches for Middle East Peace. Is the experience you went through with that particular nameless network, was it related to increased and more visible solidarity within the African American community between black intellectuals and activists regarding Palestine, or was it isolated just in terms of your case?
I think, yeah, I think it was. There were multiple things. I mean, I think there's certainly, just to be clear, a long tradition of black intellectuals and activists showing solidarity with Palestine. Noda Erekat and I actually just curated a special issue of the Journal of Palestine Studies. So if you all want to read some really nerdy out academic stuff, the whole special issue was on black Palestinian transnational solidarity, and we get at some of these histories. That said, I think that I think since the uprisings in Ferguson in 2014, where you saw Palestinians on the ground in Ferguson protesting for black lives, and you saw those very famous kind of exchanges and tweets, for example, between like Maryam Barghouti and Ferguson activists. People were in the West Bank. Maryam was in Ramallah talking to people in Ferguson. And they were telling folks, like, here's how you wash your eyes out. Here's how you make a mask out of a T-shirt to protect yourself from tear gas. Stand close to the soldiers. That way they can't tear gas you. Run toward the wind. It'll help you. So those types of practical strategies, they're like, look, we're Palestinian. We know tear gas, right? And so those types of conversations produce not just the kind of immediate solidarity, which I think is kind of ephemeral, it's passing, but it created a conversation about solidarity that then led people to go on delegations, it led people to write and do art exhibits and all kinds of renewed energy toward the question of black Palestinian solidarity. And I think the media attention to that does create a certain type of concern for people who are trying to dismantle those relationships. Because you know that the wider the coalition, the broader the solidarity movement, the more successful justice struggle you will have. And so, you know, suddenly, and Allison is part of the church kind of community, so she understands this. Black churches have oftentimes been Zionist. Black churches are often funded to go and make these kinds of tours where they see a very particular type of Holy Land narrative of the region rather than an occupation narrative of the region. And so the kind of disruption of that narrative through these renewed black Palestinian solidarities, I think are significant. And lastly, I say renewed because, you know, there is a long history from the 50s, certainly, we could look at folk, but by the time you get to the 1967 war, you got the Black Panthers, you got the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee devoting its whole July-August issue to the question of neocolonialism and the question of Palestine after the 1967 war. You see a significant amount of energy through people like Angela Davis, continued people. Like the early Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young in the 70s meeting with the PLO. I mean, there's so much energy. And so now that energy is renewed, and again, it's digital media, it's YouTube, it's all these other outlets that are showing those solidarities, that are broadcasting those connections. And I think that is the key to freedom. That is the key to justice, expanding our coalitions, thickening our democracy, and making sure that we understand that nobody is free until everybody is free.
Give Marc a hand. Okay.
My name is Ahmad Harb. I'm the Director of Research at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you to Marc Lamont Hill for a very, very nice, eye-opening keynote speech, and for providing a powerful, basically, scene setter for today's conference. For those who have joined us just now, please, there are some cards on the in front of you if you have any questions for the panelists at the end of the presentations to write your name and affiliation and ask your question as legibly as possible so we can ask it to the panelists. Please also remember to silence your devices, phones and other things, and to use the conference hashtags Arab Center 2019 and Arab Media. I have the honor of sharing the stage today with a very distinguished panel, very exceptional panelists who will examine the current state of freedom of expression across the region and the role of the media and the progress toward achieving rights and freedoms for Arab citizens. We have with us this morning, in speaking order, Rami Khouri, who is a senior public policy fellow and professor of journalism and journalist in residence at the American University in Beirut. Sahar Khamis, who is associate professor of communications at University of Maryland, College Park. Muhammad Hamas al-Masri, no relation, associate professor and chair of the Media and Cultural Studies and Journalism programs at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, and Samar Lopez, senior director of free expression programs at PEN America. Each panelist will have about 10 to 12 minutes, after which we will resume a question and answer period on those cards that I mentioned. Rami, please.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted, as always, to be here and with such a distinguished panel and a credible array of speakers and many other great people in the audience that I'm happy to interact with. And so if you'll give us, Ahmed, to give us like a 1-minute warning, just sort of
Sure, yeah.
do a dance or something, let me know. So in 10, 12 minutes, there's not much time to go into much depth, but I think to give you some main headlines about the broad trends that I've experienced. I've been now 52 years writing and working in journalism as editor, reporter, writer, doing so many different things, based in the Middle East most of the time, a few years in college in the US, but I've been working since 1968 in media, based mostly in the Arab world. And I've experienced the whole modern trajectory of what's been happening in the sphere of media and public, the public space. And I thought the title of this panel was just perfect, The Public Sphere in the Age of the New Authoritarianism. One of the points that I've made over the years is that we've never had a public sphere in the Arab world. It never existed. The political authorities or the religious or the tribal or the ideological authorities that always controlled power in our region in the modern period, say starting in the late 40s, they always controlled people so that whatever was allowed to be expressed in the public sphere reflected what the power structure wanted to be expressed. And most people went along with this. This is the intriguing thing, that if you go back to the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, the vast majority of people in the Arab world were not rising up in rebellions as they are today. They rose up in rebellions against Israel, against colonial control, other things. But the lives of most people in the Arab world, broadly speaking, in most countries between the 1940s and the early 1980s, their lives were improving steadily. And people were demanding more development. And you had groups, small groups of activists, lawyers, students, human rights people, women's groups, environmental groups. You had small groups of activists who were demanding more social justice and equity and more sustainable development, but they were very small and they had limited impact. The vast majority of people went along with the developmental thrust of the modern Arab nationalist development state. What happened in the 1970s and 80s is the modern Arab developmental state turned into a modern Arab security state that was anchored in families, supported by military, and linked directly to foreign powers. So the trajectory over the last 40, 50 years, I would say, in terms of the public sphere, is that the initial phase of the regression in freedoms expression, assembly, petition, grievances, whatever, the regression in our current situation started really in the late 40s when the first military officers took power in Iraq, and then in '52 in Egypt, and after that in other Arab countries. And it was the core constraint on the creation of a public sphere was the military control of executive government, which later controlled the judiciary and parliaments and information media and education and every other aspect of our lives. But the interesting thing is, if you go back and look at it, in the early years, say in the late 40s until the maybe 60s, essentially they were controlling people's physical bodies, where you could demonstrate in the street, what you could do physically in terms of going to vote or going to speak or doing whatever. And then the power structures were controlling essentially our hearts and our emotions with Nasser and Arab nationalism and Kulthum and Fairuz and all. There was an emotional process that was heavily guided by the power structure. And now, the dangerous thing now is that the modern Arab security state is trying to control our minds and our thoughts. They're trying to penetrate inside our thought structure and make sure that not just what we express in the public sphere, but what we think and even say in private is something that they control. And it's for that reason that I say that the single most important priority in the Arab world, and I've thought this for the last 8 or 10 years or so, the single most important priority is the preservation of an adequate space for freedom of expression, whether it's through the media or culture or education or demonstrations in the street. But individual Arab men and women need to be able to speak their mind freely and openly. And that space has been closing very steadily over the last 10, 15 years. It's really since the uprisings of 2010-11, when several of the governments in the Gulf freaked out and started applying draconian measures of mind control and thought control and arresting people for tweeting and even taking away, a few places, taking away people's citizenship for their thoughts, essentially. And of course, the worst cases you see in Egypt, where you get 50, 60,000. We don't know how many tens of thousands. Is it 40? Is it 60? But a huge number of people are in jail, mainly because of what they think, what they feel, what they believe, not because they've necessarily committed a crime. And the danger now is that you have this convergence between a tradition of autocratic, military-led, security-anchored, family-run, foreign-supported Arab governance, combined with foreign powers, and now combined with the latest technology. And this is the real danger point now, that there's a global fraternity of authoritarian digital autocrats. And these people play hardball. They don't care about the law. They don't care about personal rights. They don't care about universal declaration of anything. All they want to do is maintain their incumbency, and they want to do this now by ensuring that their citizens think the way they want them to think. Essentially, the power structure is trying to turn the Arab citizens into sheep and donkeys who basically obey orders and do their work. Then they get fed, they get water, and if needed, they get medical treatment, but they do basically the work of sheep and donkeys, that they don't think for themselves, they don't have any agency or any rights. So that's why I say this is critical. Now, why is it critical? It's because free expression is really the foundation of every other goal that a decent society aims for: development, justice, equity, opportunity, voice, compassion, prosperity, anything you think about that a society wants to achieve, you must be able to let your citizens participate in the public discussions, not just to hold power accountable, not just to inform people, but to give the citizens a chance to do two things: to participate with ideas in how to fix the problems in society. If you look at what's going on today, Lebanon, Sudan, Algeria, all over the region, Iraq, the incredible, massive demonstrations in the streets, these are people who they know what needs to be done because they know what the problem is. Because
1 minute, Rami.
Okay, so this critical element of free expression is to allow people to contribute to the discussion about how to fix their society, but more importantly, it's about how to feel like a full human being and not to feel like an animal. So the question really over time is, as we watch the situation over time, is the trend in the last 40, 50 years has seen the militarization of the Arab state, the pauperization of the Arab citizen, and now what we're seeing is the attempt to denude the Arab mind of any kind of agency or capacity to think in itself. I want to just finish with one quote. I attended last night a very moving ceremony that was, by chance I went, some of my friends were going, so I went with them. It was the Joe Calloway Award for Civic Courage, and they gave the award to two Americans, George Luber and John Barnett. One of them, George Luber, was the fellow at the disease control centers he's a scientist who has the most significant information on climate change and its health risks, and the administration shut him down basically. And he told us about his experience, but he said one thing at the very end, which pertains, I think, to all of us as we look around the world and try to figure out how do we work together to confront this global fraternity of digital autocrats. He said, when they come at you with lies, always fight back with the truth, because the truth always hits back harder. And I think that's the message that I feel in the Middle East, and we see it here with whistleblowers in the United States. The truth is the only power that we actually have, and we must use it now to try to maintain this space for public discussion and citizen expression. Thank you.
Thank you, Rami. Sahar?
All right, good morning, everyone. Is the voice clear? Awesome. Thank you so much for the Arab Center in Washington for having me as a speaker in this important conference and this important panel. With the inception of the Arab Spring movements back in 2011, there was a moment of euphoria in general. People were euphoric. They said this is a moment of liberation. There is no turning back to the situation beforehand. There is no going back to autocracy and dictatorship. And that is our golden moment of liberation. And with that came also a moment of techno-euphoria, hailing the role of social media in the process of cyber activism, defined as the use of social media as a tool to bring about liberation and to push forward for socio-political transformation and change. Social media was overcredited, hailed, and celebrated as tools of liberation, mobilization, and change. So much so that we even heard terms like Egypt's Facebook revolution, Tunisia's Twitter uprising, Syria's YouTube uprising. And I always alert my students, like, wait a moment, these are just tools, they're not magic, and they cannot bring about democratization or reform or change all by themselves. When I was giving a talk at that time at the Woodrow Wilson Center in the Middle East program, and I was very much euphoric, being an Egyptian, I was like, yes, this is the golden moment for Egypt and for Arab women in general. There's no turning back. And I remember after I finished, the moderator said, Dr. Khamis, this is excellent, but don't you think you're a little bit upbeat? And I was like, no, this is the golden moment. There's no turning back. 8 years later, I'm like, yeah, I guess I was a little bit upbeat. So that is what I'm trying to talk about today, really, is this turning moment when we're really revisiting these notions of the over-crediting and over-celebration of the role of social media. We are now seeing very serious and very dangerous shifts in the so-called post-Arab Spring countries. With the unique exception of Tunisia, we are seeing very, very harsh and difficult realities. We are even seeing worse realities than what existed before 2011 We're seeing civil war in Syria, fighting and war in Yemen. We are seeing sectarian strife in Libya and a return to a much worse military dictatorship in Egypt. So what is happening here? What is happening for me as a communication scholar focusing on the role of social media and new media? We are seeing them changing from just being tools of revolution to being tools of counter-revolution, spreading counter-narratives and becoming tools of counter-revolution. Changing from being tools of spreading awareness and information to becoming tools of spreading disinformation and misinformation. From tools of liberation to tools of repression. From tools of unity and solidarity to tools of fragmentation and polarization and division. And let me just give a few concrete examples so that we are not just talking in an abstract sense. In the case of my own home country, Egypt, we saw in 2011 this glorious moment of Tahrir Square, right? This iconic moment when everybody, Christian, Muslim, Islamist, secular, men, women, rich, poor, were all united in Tahrir Square in this wonderful image. When everyone has the same message, like Mubarak must go, irhal, 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 social media become very effective tools of creating solidarity and unity. They become very effective catalysts. They speed up the process of transformation and change, and they become amplifiers. They make the message even louder, and they become effective mobilization tools. They rally people, they help in networking, in getting people out in the street and spreading the message, and getting everyone united under one banner. However, when we start to see other shifts, like what happened in Egypt in 2013, when a military takeover, ousted Egypt's first democratically elected president, President Mohamed Morsi, we saw a very deep moment of polarization and division. There was not even an agreement on a definition of what actually happened at that moment. People were divided, and they still are. Some said this is definitely the classic definition of a military coup. Others said, no, this is Egypt's second revolution. And a third group said, well, maybe it's a popularly backed coup. It's an interesting term that they coined in order to give legitimacy to the whole thing. From that moment onward, we are seeing a deepening polarization and division and fragmentation in Egypt, so much so that people are giving each other names and calling each other's names. Oh, if you are, pro-Sisi, you're a traitor. If you are pro-Morsi, you are a terrorist. And, God forbid, families are broken and divided. Some people are exiled, they cannot go back to their home countries, and there is all of this process of fragmentation. So what role does social media play here? It's a very dangerous role. Social media are weaponized in this case. They act as tools to increase the division and widen the gap and increase the polarization and the fragmentation which is already existing. How? Because everybody is going to use the social media platform as their weapon to get back at the other one. So I'm going to use my Twitter feed to attack you. You're not going to be silent, of course. You're going to use your Twitter feed to attack me back with even harsher and stronger language. And from that moment onward, we're seeing really a deterioration in terms of level of democracy and freedom in Egypt. As our colleague Rami Khouri explained, more than 60,000 political prisoners, a lot of activists, journalists, bloggers, and others are behind bars. Many are in exile, and many are killed or even forcibly disappeared. What is a very important point here to remember also is the governments building the learning curve. At the very beginning of the Arab Spring movements, we saw the activists and the protesters, the young people, having a lead. They were a few steps ahead of the regimes. They were the ones who are the change agents, the ones who are agents of change and mobilization in their country. They are the ones who were mastering the technology, being very technologically savvy, and very much taking a few steps ahead of their own respective regimes. This is not the case now in 2019 as we speak. We are seeing now a rise in the process of quote-unquote cyber wars, the tug of war between regimes and their opponents, whether they're activists, journalists, bloggers, you name it. Just like the activists and journalists and bloggers have been looking and listening and learning and improving and building their learning curves, so are the autocratic and authoritarian and repressive regimes as well. They're also pretty much improving their learning curve. And we can see many examples of that. When the Arab Spring broke out in 2011, Egypt and Tunisia were taken by surprise. Nobody had a clue what was going on. The governments were panicking. We saw that the Egyptian government shutting down the internet, we call it, pulling down the kill switch for a whole week and keeping the country in a blackout and cutting down the cell phone service, which really led to a huge, economic loss. The country lost a lot of money. Now, Syria, did not repeat the exact same mistakes. It was looking at learning and learning from what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt. So it actually started to just shut down the internet on Thursday evening and Friday when people are most likely to protest, and create the Syrian Electronic Army, which is an army of hackers that really goes after the opponents and really tracks their IP addresses, shutting down their websites, blocking, hacking, and in some severe cases going after them physically, arresting them, or even killing them. So the governments are definitely building their learning curves. But is that only applicable to Arab Spring countries? Well, we can also argue that non-Arab Spring countries are trying to use repressive and authoritarian measures using their own learning curve of technological savviness and trying to learn the lesson in order to prevent the movement or the tide of the Arab Spring from reaching their own countries. We can call this preventive measures. And what can be a clearer example than the case of Saudi Arabia? Well, we see, for example, not just the arrest of many different activists, bloggers, human rights activists. We even see the paradoxical case of hailing women's rights and talking about, yeah, we want to help women's rights. Now we're allowing women to drive. Trevor Noah said that comes after the cars are driving themselves, really. But, on one hand, there is this kind of rhetoric, and then on the other hand, we see the jailing of many different women activists who are calling for women's rights. The war on the ground is pretty much also a war online. So it's both online and on the ground at the same time. We are seeing the creation of what is called a Zubab al-Elektroni, the cyber troops or the cyber armies that go after the opponents and go after the activists for the purpose of silencing them. And of course, in some severe cases, we even saw the ultimate silencing of Jamal Khashoggi, God bless his soul, the famous Washington Post columnist and activist and journalist and speaker who was, killed in a very horrific way as a prize for his quest for freedom and for having freedom of expression and human rights in his own home country, Saudi Arabia. So what do we need to do now as academics, as people who are observing this whole situation? We need to have a deeper, more critical, and more analytical lens at looking at this whole platform and all of these shifts, transitions, and transformations. Revisit all our previous notions now. Think about how cyberspace can not just be a tool for liberation, as I said, but can also be a tool of repression, how it can get co-opted by authoritarian and autocratic regimes in power to suppress and to silence their opponents, both on the ground as well as online. We need to think about this cyberspace as cross-cutting some very important spheres, the private spheres and the public spheres. And I agree with you, there's no such thing as the Arab quote-unquote public sphere. We can only talk about multiple public spheres with a plural S. Cross-cutting the private and the public, the online and the offline. Cross-cutting gender differences, cross-cutting socioeconomic differences, cross-cutting the authoritarian and the libertarian, liberation and repression, cross-cutting all of these spheres simultaneously at the same time. That will require us to rethink again about our moment of techno-euphoria or technological determinism and think about something much more realistic. Techno-realism. Let's leave the two undesirable extremes of cyber utopianism or cyber utopia or cyber optimism that kind of overcredits and overhails and over-celebrates the role of social media, as I said at the beginning, or cyber pessimism, which says, oh, these tools are not important. Look what is happening. We have a reversal in freedom. Nothing is going to happen. We need to be in the middle ground of cyber realism, techno-realism. Assess what has happened, be proud of what has been achieved, but also be very aware of the challenges and the threats and the dangers that are happening now and the threats and the dangers ahead. Likewise, we can say the same about the Arab Spring movements. I don't think they are dead. I think they are in the ICU, in the intensive care unit, but there is still pulse. And we are seeing this pulse. We're seeing it in the region. We are seeing it in Lebanon. We're seeing it in Algeria. We're seeing it in Sudan. We're seeing it in many parts of the Arab world. So I think we just need to revive this kind of pulse and use social media realism and cyber realism as an effective tool to do so. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank the Arab Center for inviting me. Certainly, Rami and Sahar are tough acts to follow, but I'll do my best. I want to think in the brief time that I have about not just this new authoritarianism, but I want to think about the health of Arab public spheres, the health of Arab information environments, in light of authoritarianism and also in light of changing norms of professionalism, journalistic professionalism. So let me start with a theoretical point. I would say that if we want to assess the health of Arab public spheres, we have to be able to examine faithfully Arab political systems and structures. So there was a classic text written in 1956. The media scholars in the room will recognize it, The Four Theories of the Press by Siebert, Peterson, and Schramm. And there are some problems with the book. I don't want to talk about the book, but one of the overarching theses is accepted as valid, and that is that media systems are simply reflections of the larger socio-political environments in which they are situated. This is necessarily the case, okay? So if we want to understand Arab information environments, Arab media systems, and we have to look at Arab political systems and structures. And so in a lot of the research that I do, I focus on political systems and structures, and I look at political events. And I want to talk briefly today about a study that I recently co-authored about the Gulf crisis, the ongoing Arabian Gulf crisis. Let me make another point, though, first, maybe a couple of points quickly. And I'm glad that Rami and Sahar touched on this, but we need to think in terms of plural. The Arab region is not monolithic. There are a lot of differences between and among countries and media systems. This is very, very important, because too often we talk about the region as though it's homogeneous and monolithic. We talk about the Arab media system, right? And that's very problematic. So let's think of a couple of examples quickly. Look at the Gulf region. You have three countries, Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, that I like to think about. They're all in the Gulf. They have a lot of similarities and overlaps in terms of how they operate politically, but there are also vast differences, both politically and in terms of their media systems. Saudi Arabia would be they would be classified according to Siebert, Peterson, and Schramm's typology. They would be classified as an authoritarian system, pretty much absolutely authoritarian. Kuwait, there's more room for political contestation. There's more openness. And as a result, the media discourse is more pluralistic in Kuwait, right? So it's a partly free media system. And then Qatar is a very interesting case, because you almost have multiple systems operating in parallel in Qatar. You have a sort of a traditional Arab media model, for lack of a better term, but then you also have the Al Jazeera phenomenon, right, which is a phenomenon in and unto itself. Higher level of pluralism and diversity of opinion, debate, and higher levels of journalistic professionalism at Al Jazeera. So you see these differences in three countries that essentially neighbor one another in the Arab region. So the Arab region, talking about Arab media systems, is complicated. It's complex. It's not simple and straightforward. Think about Egypt, and like Sahar, I do a lot of my research on Egypt, and Egypt's an important country geopolitically. It also has the largest Arab media industry, right? You saw three different media systems in Egypt in just a few years. You had the Mubarak era system, media system, governed by the 1971 Constitution. I would say that it was authoritarian leaning, but certainly not absolutely authoritarian, right? Anyone who thinks that the Mubarak era was absolutely authoritarian has been in for a very rude awakening during the Sisi period, okay? So you have these two periods, the Sisi period with a new constitution, by the way, a new political system and structure, and the Mubarak period sandwiched around a period of greater opening, right? From 2011 until 2013, you had a nascent democratic order. And here I disagree with some of my colleagues, respectfully, of course, at my old university, the American University in Cairo. Some of my colleagues were writing and arguing that that period from 2011 to 2013, in their words, was an unprecedented period of repression and restrictiveness in Egypt. I could not disagree more. In fact, during that 2-year stretch where Egypt had democratic elections, there was a democratically elected president, the media discourse was much more vibrant than anything else that we've seen in Egypt. There were more than 40 political parties vying and jockeying for position in the political marketplace, and they had seats at the table on national media and in the newspapers, and we saw this play itself out. In fact, and this rubs some people the wrong way, but I've written that I think there was too much freedom in Egypt. Yes, I know some of you are like, whoa, how can a media scholar say that? It's sacrilegious. But let me explain briefly. I was living in Egypt during this time. You had people on national television and writing columns in national newspapers quite literally calling for violence against the elected government, and also quite literally calling for a military coup. I wrote an article 7 months before the coup complaining about this, essentially, right? This was very problematic to me as a media scholar and as an American. These are things that would not be allowed in Western democratic societies, and we ended up with the military coup, didn't we, in the summer of 2013. So, anyways, in Egypt we had 3 different media systems in just a few years, and I'd be happy to speak to that in the Q&A if there's time. So, I want to talk briefly. I mentioned about the Gulf crisis. I recently co-authored a paper. It will be out, if anyone's interested. It'll be published in Global Media and Communication next year in 2020, one of the peer-reviewed journals. I wrote this paper with Sukaina Ajaoud, who's a former graduate student at the Doha Institute, and we looked at media coverage patterns of the Gulf crisis in Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. So Al Jazeera, Qatari affiliated, and Al Arabiya, Saudi affiliated. We wanted to look at the framing mechanisms. So we set up a traditional quantitative content analysis. It was driven by the framing paradigm. So we were looking at dominant frames. We were looking at directionality. We were looking at the length of news segments, how much time was devoted to different topics. We were looking at guests and sourcing and keywords and associations and other things. And I don't have time to go through the statistical data with you, but what I can tell you is that these 2 networks, perhaps unsurprisingly, presented 2 completely different pictures, 2 completely different versions of reality. If you're watching Al Arabiya, you're getting one event, and then you turn on Al Jazeera and you're like, what is, this is a completely different event, okay? And I want us to think about this, right, in a discussion like this. I want us to think about the ramifications of this polarization, this increased level of rivalry, not just in the Gulf region, but across the Arab region. Because what you've seen happen now is that nations in the region and news outlets in the region have fallen in line with one narrative or the other. They've had to take positions, and it's very polarized. It's a lot of black and white. There is not a lot of nuance. There aren't many news outlets trying to be, in the middle or play a balanced role. So this is very, very interesting, perhaps even alarming. If you look at the regional, the pan-Arab news outlets like Al-Hayat, Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, Al-Arabi Al-Jadid, they've all sort of fallen in line. Even if you look at the local outlets in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Qatar, in neighboring countries, again, very polarizing media environment. And I like to think about what are the implications. And here I have more questions than I have answers, quite honestly. But what are the implications of all of this for journalistic professionalism in the Arab region? We already know prior to this crisis, prior to the Gulf crisis, the most recent version or most recent iteration of the Gulf crisis, because it's not new, prior to this, we know that there was a crisis of professionalism, that a lot of journalists in the region see themselves as activists and advocates and extensions of political arms. So now what has happened? This has been arguably exacerbated. What are the implications for the Arab news consumer? If you're someone who's genuinely trying to find out what's going on, what do you do and to whom do you turn? These are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in. And social media, people will say, well, social media. But social media is a very contaminated environment, as Sahar was alluding to, right? First of all, the governments are still the power brokers, even on social media. They're employing vast social media machinery, right? As Sahar was talking about at the end of her talk. So what is the state of the information environment in the Arab region? What is happening to norms of journalistic professionalism? Where does the Arab news consumer turn? What is going to happen when ultimately there is a truce? At some point, this conflict is going to be mediated. It might be in a year, it might be in 5 years, it might be in 20. But at some point, that's going to happen. What then does Al Jazeera do? What does Al Arabiya do? Do they go in a single night from going from attacking their avowed enemy to then saying that everything is okay and well, we were just joking, they're fine? This is the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. And again, I have more questions than I have answers, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhammad. Summer.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here and with all of these co-panelists, so thank you. I think, as the description for this session notes, there is a real contrast between two of the narratives that we're kind of seeing play out in the region right now, and I do find this framing of the public sphere, the public spheres, to be a helpful one, and to think about who the players are in that and how those spheres are situated in the different contexts that we're seeing playing out, what space there is for those spheres to exist and to move forward. So touch on a couple different things. I want to talk a little bit about the protest movements that we're seeing right now and the role of social media and the press in that context. And then also, because I'm with PEN America and we're an organization of and for writers and artists and intellectuals, I want to talk a little bit about the way in which those groups are also affected right now and the way that they're targeted around the region for their expression and their role in, I think maybe we don't always think of them as part of the media structure, but I think that's an element to consider as well. So there is this one narrative, a resurgence of freedom of expression in protest movements across the region, and it is a fascinating time to have these conversations as we're looking at what has happened over the past year in Algeria, in Sudan, in Iraq, and now in Lebanon. And I think, the Western narrative around the Arab Spring has been very oversimplified, right? That it was dead because apparently failing to dismantle decades worth of power structures in a year or two was a failure. But clearly that's not the case, right? This is a long-term process that has to happen in the region, and I think that this is an important moment for people to kind of reflect on the fact that that perspective is definitely a little oversimplified. And also that those who stand in the way of that change have always been and remain on the wrong side of history. But of course, there are other narratives that are also true. There is this new authoritarianism of which Sisi and MBS are maybe the most emblematic. More brutal, more shameless, more tech-savvy, as Sahar was saying, and also more emboldened, I think, in part because of our own government and our own failure to really stand up to these strong men and certainly to hold anybody accountable for a range of actions, but perhaps most notably the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And so I think, we see certainly the way that the public sphere has shifted in those spaces where there used to be red lines that people kind of understood, things you could say or couldn't say online or in private, that have disappeared, and that those spaces are now much more constricted than they used to be. So I think in terms of these protests, I think it's very interesting, some of the things that are different about them from what we saw in 2011. First of all, in Sudan and Algeria, I think they sort of emerged outside of the capital cities. Sort of the groups who were at the forefront were a bit different than what we saw in 2011. But also, as Sahar was saying, we're also in a very different social media landscape, and the role of Facebook and Twitter in 2011. I started using Twitter because of the Arab Spring, right? Because it was the only way to know, as Marc was saying earlier, what was really happening on the ground. You couldn't read the news for that. You had to go on Twitter to hear from people directly, and that was an amazing thing. That euphoria is indeed gone, I think, and it seems like these protests are not necessarily kind of reliant on social media in the same way. But it's also just not the same sort of space that it was at that point, right? At that time, it was clear that the regimes didn't really understand this tool. It got away from them. They didn't see its potential. They didn't understand how to harness it. That's clearly very different right now. Right now, they're the ones with sophisticated surveillance technology, with armies of government-sponsored trolls to harass and smear journalists and activists, and with very well orchestrated disinformation campaigns that they're carrying out. So I very much agree that that is a space where we have to be much more realistic about both the potential and the risks. I think, it's also just harder to see social media as a force for democracy really anywhere in the world these days, with much of the debates that we're having about Facebook generally. But I think particularly in a region where the governments have learned so well how to weaponize it, and where now it feels like the tech companies are the ones who are a bit on the back foot, not really able to keep up with the problems. And then I think, what we're seeing right now also just kind of highlights the problems with press freedom that we see across the region and the limitations that journalists and the media face. For me, the timing is interesting to think about this question because PEN America is actually, we're literally this week putting the final touches on a report on the state of local news in the United States. And so we're thinking a lot about why the news matters for democracy. And the short version about the state of local news here is that it's very bad. More to come next week. But I think the reasons why local news in the US matters are the same reasons that news matters everywhere. It is to keep the people informed, it is to hold the powerful to account, and at its best, it is to build social cohesion and underpin democracy. And without robust press freedoms, you're not really able to fulfill those functions. And I think, there are certainly journalists and news outlets across the Arab world who are, despite all their constraints, being able to fulfill, I think, at least the first two of those functions, perhaps not always at scale, but there are people carrying those out. For the third one, though, I think for media to really foster social cohesion and strengthen and move forward democratic systems, I think, a bit as Mohammed was saying, you need the enabling environment for that. That doesn't kind of come out of nowhere. And so I think there are very few spaces in the Arab world where there is the potential for media to really play that role. Maybe Tunisia is certainly the best example. And I think we kind of see that in the context of elections, right? That journalists are able to kind of push this process forward, keep this process more accountable in ways that we don't see in a lot of places in the region. So let me just speak for a few minutes about writers and artists. Attacks on journalists often garner more attention, but they are usually not alone in being targeted by authoritarians. We often see writers, novelists, poets, bloggers, singers, and visual artists also being targeted, and that's because art is powerful, right? It's another form of shaping the narrative, and it's a critical piece of free expression in any place, but particularly in a place where the powers that be are trying to control that narrative. So we also see a lot of the same tactics used against writers and artists that we do against the media. Charges of spreading false news, inciting protests, the use of terrorism and cybersecurity laws. And perhaps not surprisingly, Egypt, I'll come back to Egypt again, is one of the worst offenders on this front as well. So Sisi's government has imprisoned novelists, singers, photographers, poets. PEN America gives a Freedom to Write award every year to an imprisoned writer or artist or journalist, and a few years ago we gave it to Ahmed Naji, who's an Egyptian novelist, who was imprisoned for about a year based on the content of a novel that he wrote. A complaint was lodged by a citizen who read the novel and said that the explicit sex scenes in it raised his heartbeat, and Ahmed was sentenced to prison as a result for violating public modesty. Galal al-Bahari is a poet and a songwriter. I think he's a particularly strong example. He wrote a song, Balaha, which was sung by the exiled singer Rami Assam, and he was also at the same time writing a book of poetry, preparing to publish it, called The Finest Women on Earth, which he described as a testament to the value of women and of their good deeds in this world. He had permission to publish the book, and then his publisher pulled out from the contract at the last minute. And a few days after the song was released, right around the same time, he was arrested, disappeared for a week. When he reappeared, he showed signs of torture. He faced charges in both civilian and military courts, and in June of last year, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for insulting the military and spreading the false news with his book of poetry. And he's currently in Torah prison as a result. We've also seen similar cases in Saudi Arabia. Fahad al-Fahad, a writer arrested in 2016, was sentenced to 5 years in prison and received a lifetime ban on writing and working for the media. He was ironically charged with violating the cybercrimes law in parts for tweets that criticized the Saudi criminal justice system. Ashraf Ayyad is a Palestinian poet and contemporary artist arrested in Saudi on the basis of the atheist content of his work and for having long hair. And he was at one point sentenced to death, although that was recently commuted to 8 years. And he's been in prison since January of 2014. And Sahar mentioned the Saudi women writers and activists who are in prison and who PEN America gave our Freedom to Write Award this year to 3 of them, Nouf Abdulaziz, Lujain Al-Haflul, and Iman Al-Nafjan, who, as she mentioned, had all used their writing to advocate for women's rights and against the ban on driving. And I just feel, MBS is putting them in prison, subjecting them to torture at the same time as he overturns that ban is just one of these pure exertions of power, right? You don't make change. Your words don't make change. Only I make change. And Nouf and Lujain have now been in prison for over 500 days. So I think as we consider the digital technologies that may be facilitating democratic movements or empowering authoritarians, that it's important to take time to think about how much energy and effort these regimes are also putting into attacking people for their poems, for their blog posts, for their songs. These may not be as advanced, but they clearly see them as a threat, and I think there's a reason for that, right? Creativity and imagination is all that it takes to imagine a different world, and that is very much a threat to those who are deeply invested in the status quo.
Thank you. Thank you. We can take some questions from the audience, but I'm going to ask a question to the panelists. Anybody is free to pick it up. It's just, we're talking about the public sphere and the new authoritarianism. The public sphere and the new authoritarianism is, everybody is under this new authoritarianism. Social media and access to media in general is probably also a reflection of socioeconomic status. So generally speaking, urban centers are probably more exposed to media, use media, have newspapers, computers, all these things to access media. What has been the shape of this public sphere in the comparison between urban centers and the countryside? I mean, are there discernible differences in how people look at things? How do they look at them, and through what means? So, anybody?
I'll just make a quick comment on that. What I've observed in places like Jordan and Lebanon, where I've lived for many years, is that one of the surprising things, perhaps, is that many of the public demonstrations and the most brazen public challenge to the regimes, not challenge to overthrow them, but just to stand up to them and tell them you're doing a lousy job and you got to do better, or somebody else should replace you. Peaceful protests have come from rural areas, provincial areas. Because they were the most marginalized, they were the most discriminated against, they were the most mistreated, and rural areas. One of the fascinating trajectories I mentioned in the developmental process in the Arab world is for the first 40, 50 years of Arab development, central governments often gave extra care to rural areas to provide them with services and give them jobs, mostly in the security services, to get them to be basic pillars of the regimes and support the regimes. or in places like Lebanon and other places, to support sectarian leaders because they were so dependent on them. And what happened in the last 20 years is the central government could no longer afford to keep doing that, and therefore the rural areas were the ones to suffer most when the central government pulled back from running a welfare state, and therefore they're the ones who felt most the pain of poverty and the most disappointment of being dropped like a hotcake by your government when your government could no longer give you money. So I think there's not I think there aren't, my impression is there are not major differences between rural and urban centers. The human being basically feels the same thing, behaves the same way. What is different maybe is that in urban centers people are more organized into unions and civil society groups and protest groups and special interest groups and WhatsApp groups. So people are much more organized, but that's the nature of urban society. But in terms of political sentiment and the will to express themselves and the demand to be treated like a human being and not like a donkey or a sheep, I think it's pretty much the same.
Ahmed, thank you for asking this question, because I think this has been a blind spot for a very long time. I think one of the things we need to address in the quote-unquote post-Arab Spring phase is really kind of the over-urbanization in our focus, looking at media and social media. Where is activism? The rural parts have been oftentimes overlooked and ignored, when in fact, for example, some of the strongest anti-coup protests came out in rural areas in Egypt after what happened in 2013, and there were even some peasants and rural people on donkeys holding the banner coup in English, trying to attract international media attention, but they got very little attention and very little coverage, unfortunately. The cameras are always rolling in the urban areas. When you think of the Arab Spring, you only think of Tahrir Square, and I always tell my students at the University of Maryland, yes, Tahrir Square was very important and very iconic, but guess what? It was not the only place where Arabs were going out in the streets protesting. There are so many other cities and towns and small neighborhoods, even slums and villages in Egypt that witnessed the movements and uprisings. There are so many other towns and cities in other Arab countries. Look at Sidi Bouzid, this small town that ignited the whole flames of the Arab Spring, right, literally and metaphorically, that very, very, very few people knew anything about. Also, when the whistleblower Muhammad Ali, the 45-year-old contractor and businessman, started to talk about having protests in Egypt, and that started to have some trickle-down effect to the street, maybe not on a large magnitude, but it was described by outlets like Washington Post and New York Times as rare and shocking protests that are very meaningful and important. Some of these protests happened in rural areas. In fact, they happened in Upper Egypt, places like Qida, Sohag. Some of these areas in rural Egypt and in Upper rural Egypt, for two reasons. Number one, as Rami mentioned, neglected and have less socioeconomic share, they have less of the pie, so to speak. Their share is very limited in terms of services, in terms of economic resources, and also there is less, police presence on the streets, which is more tense and intense in urban areas like Tahrir Square and in the streets of Cairo. So these two reasons, less economic resources and less police presence, really kind of encouraged people to go out in the streets more in rural areas and in Upper Egypt. Did it get enough media attention? Again, the answer is no. So I think that's a blind spot that we really need to address.
Thank you. Mohammed, you want to comment?
I'm good.
You're good. You? No, okay. All right, I have quite a few questions here. I'll start with Rami on the other side. Many questions about what you said and about general other things. For instance, what is he? Hamid from the Egyptian Arab, what is it? I'm sorry. Egyptian American Relations Council says that with people moving places of employment, journalists hopping from one job to another, sometimes they probably do not have exactly what they're basically insecure of in their position, in their job position. How can they really reflect reality the way it's supposed to be reflected? So basically, we're talking about the socioeconomic status of the journalists themselves, of the media people.
My experience in media organizations in the Arab world for all these decades is that for the most part, with some exceptions, for the most parts, the best people don't go into journalism, unfortunately, because it has always been a domain that was totally dominated by the government, has to be licensed by the government, and the government creates the laws that allow it to work or not to work. Everything is government controlled. So if you're going to go into the media in the Arab world, essentially you're going to be an apparatchik for the government. And most people didn't mind doing that at one point because the media was, in the 60s and 70s, the media was doing some pretty lively stuff in many Arab countries. So it wasn't always, authoritarian repression, but it was controlled. And in many cases, the media was not just licensed, but financed by the government or owned by the government. And that's increased now much, much more. So now, a lot of the media in the Arab world are Saudi or Emirati owned or indirectly owned or controlled. So the profession of journalism attracted either hardcore political activists, and somebody, I think, Muhammad mentioned that a lot of the journalists were activists, actually masquerading as journalists, but they were in there for a political cause, as is the case in many journalists here in the Western world. It's the nature of journalism. But the reality is that you can't expect Arab journalists in Arab countries to do serious journalism for the most part. There are exceptions, and there are people, including we have Daoud Kutab with us, and we have others here who do serious journalism on the internet and community radio. So you can do, some people do investigative journalism, but these are pockets, and they're based on individual, courageous, honest journalists who insist on staying in the Arab world and trying to do their job there. Jamal Khashoggi and I often talked about these things because he worked in the Gulf, I worked in Lebanon and Jordan, and we both had the same sense that we want to stay in the Arab world, we want to be journalists, we want to try to do the best we can, and we know there's limits, we work with the limits, but we try to work from within inside to push the limits as much as we can. And so you have people all over the region who try to be as professional as they can, but today it's very, very difficult because of the polarization and the financial controls. This is going to change eventually. Social media has opened whole new opportunities for self-expression. It has not yet created significant new structural media organizations in the way that it has in the Western world, where if you look at the digital media, you have incredible institutionalized quality journalism, most of it progressive on the left, but even you have some people on the right, but these are strong, active, influential media or institutions that are digital. That's starting to happen very, very slowly in the Arab world, and the problem is that the best journalists have to go overseas, and for the most part, again, there's always exceptions, but the exceptions are very, very limited.
Thank you. This question is from Wafa Hallam from Inside Arabia to Sahar. Where do Arab women stand, and to what degree have they impacted the political process? Was their participation in protests and activism significant or only marginal?
Right, I'll try to
Very
answer this
direct
as
question.
briefly as I can. It's a very important topic, dear and near to my heart. And one of the things I did not talk about, earlier in my, talk because in the interest of time, is cyberfeminism. This process of how women are creating this sister term. We talked about cyber activism in general. Cyberfeminism is when women actually use social media to advance their own causes which are important for them. And I always say women have a dual struggle. Yes, they have the political struggle alongside men to try to shake authoritarian regimes and repressive regimes and dictatorships, but they have a parallel struggle, which is trying to shake the societal mindset that has been very unfavorable to women in many parts of the world, especially in many parts of the Arab world, because of a number of reasons: stagnant traditions and patriarchal culture, negative mindset, around women and all of that stuff. many of which, by the way, has been blamed on Islam, but in fact, it has been because of societal and cultural factors, and I totally agree that we cannot separate all of these factors from the overall and overarching socioeconomic, political structure and context in these different societies. Having said that, we have to see a very clear fact here. Women are on the front lines of resistance when it comes to things like the Arab Spring movements. They were in the front lines of resistance, putting their own lives at risk, taking bullets, being arrested, being harassed, being raped, and even being killed, right? And then once you have a movement is over, in whichever way, they're told, thank you so much, ladies, it's time to go back to the kitchen. You can go to the hair salon and do your nails. Somehow they're marginalized and they're pushed to the side. And we've seen that in Egypt when women, after the ousting of Mubarak, thought, this is our golden moment, let's have a 1 million women march in Tahrir Square on International Women's Day. Only 500 women showed up, and they were negatively chanted at. They were told, this is not the time for this. Let's focus on building the country economically and politically. This is not the time for quote-unquote women's issues. So really, this is a very dangerous phenomenon, and I hope women will learn the lesson that when you are putting your own life at risk and you are in the front lines of resistance, you should never allow yourself and allow others to marginalize you or to push you aside and just say, oh, women's issues are not now important or relevant. Women are half of society, and they give birth to the second half. So if we push them aside and say this is not, thank you. If we push them aside and say this is not the time for women's issues, what you are doing is you're doing something very detrimental and very dangerous and very negative to the overall improvement and welfare of society as a whole. And therefore, we really saw the only country that emerged out of the Arab Spring with somehow good results and positive results, Tunisia, right? Unsurprisingly, that's also the case where women have the best education, more than 90% literacy rate. Women are highly educated. They also are on the bench. They are judges, and they are at the table. And I always say, if you are at the table, you will not be on the menu. And this is very important. Women have been on the menu for a very long time. It's time for them to be on the bench. It's time for them to be at the table. It's time for them to be decision makers. And that can never be divorced from the overall socioeconomic and political context. If you see a repression and going back to autocracy and dictatorship, as we have seen in the rest of the so-called quote-unquote post-Arab Spring countries, that will definitely negatively impact women's agenda and women's rights. There will also be a backlash in women's activism. Many of them are going to be jailed, arrested, harassed, exiled, and we have seen that in the quote-unquote post-Arab Spring countries, with the exception of Tunisia. Again, is that surprising? No, because Tunisia is the one country that was able to really kind of save its democratic experiment and was able to create a safe and smooth transition to democracy. We have seen their wonderful, free and transparent elections recently. So again, that's where you have more empowerment for women, because women are part and parcel of the overall socioeconomic and political context. We can never detach one from the other.
Thank you very much, Sahar. This question is for Mohammed Al-Masri from Nick I think it's Benavista, from Center for International Media Assistance. Can journalistic professionalism be addressed in the region under current patterns of media outlet ownership?
The short answer is no.
No.
Well, let me give you a longer answer. I said at the beginning of my talk that media systems are inextricably linked with political systems and structures. So what's going to happen in the Arab region is that there's going to have to be a serious democratic reform movement. And yes, ownership structures are going to have to change. Right now, the overwhelming majority of news outlets in the region are owned by the government. And a lot of those that aren't owned by the government are owned by government-friendly business people, okay? I mean, like, people talk about the liberalization of certain governments who've granted, private newspaper licenses to business people. But the problem is that they only grant those licenses to certain people, right? Those that are friendly with the regime. So it's a major challenge. It's a major problem. And again, nothing is going to change, at least not substantively, until there's a more serious and sustained democratic push. And I go back to Egypt, as an example. I mean, right after the revolution in 2011, and I talked about that opening, that brief 2-year opening, but that's what happened. All of a sudden you had, people, private people owning, all these news networks just popped up out of nowhere. And so you had this very vibrant and sometimes chaotic discourse, media discourse. At one level, it was very healthy. And then, at another level, as I kind of alluded to in my talk, it wasn't the healthiest, form of discourse. But yeah, that's one major, ownership is one major challenge, but there are many other challenges. Ownership is but one variable.
Okay, this question is from Michael Hudson, and any or all, so I'm going to give it to Summer and put her on the spot. Please discuss Saudi Arabia's role in shaping the media environment throughout the Arab world and beyond.
Well, I might let others speak to that as well, but I guess I will talk about, one angle on it, which I do think is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So I think obviously there's sort of like ownership questions, which maybe Mohammed can speak to as well, but I think that, the implications of that, there's so many reasons that this particular murder, I think, has sort of captured people's attention in a way that many others do not, and partially just the brutality of it, the sort of arrogance of carrying it out in the way that they did. But I think also the way in which it sort of reached outside even of Saudi's borders and said, this dissenting voice is unacceptable. We will silence it wherever it is. And so I think that has implications that certainly go beyond Saudi Arabia and affect freedom of expression and press freedom both across the region, but also globally. I think that now there are people in exile and journalists who may have gone, elsewhere in the world to gain professionalism or to seek other opportunities, or in exile because of the things they wanted to say and cover, who no longer feel safe, and in ways that they might have a few years ago. So I think that that particular act has many long-term consequences, and I think this is a broader trend that we're seeing of these sort of extrajudicial, extraterritorial attacks on journalists and dissidents, not just from Saudi, but from China, from other countries, other authoritarian states as well, from Russia. And I think that as we see that as an increasing trend, it has vast consequences for press freedom globally.
Can I chime in really
please.
quickly? I want to answer that in a little bit of a different way. I agree with everything Samar said. But I think one of the interesting things is that in terms of, if we talk about Saudi power or Egyptian power for that matter, or Emirati power, one of the interesting things that we've seen play out over the last couple of years is that these governments, all of these repressive governments, are learning important lessons about the limits to their power. So the Saudis never expected to get the kind of to receive the kind of international outcry that they've received after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. They didn't expect this international media blitz. They didn't expect all these scathing human rights reports. They didn't expect the reaction of the Turkish government or other governments, many in the West, in Europe, even the United States. They didn't expect all the critical media coverage. The Sisi government, I talked about Egypt, they have everything on lockdown inside of their country, but they're learning that they can't control what goes on outside of their country. So Muhammad Ali, who Sahar mentioned, here's this whistleblower, he's in Spain, and he's in the midst, I think, of bringing down the Sisi government. I mean, it might take a few years, but I think that's what, I think we're witnessing the beginning of the end of the Sisi government. And Sisi's very, Sisi is terrified. Sisi, maybe my prediction will be wrong, but I'm not wrong about that. The Sisi government is terrified. I could go through a long list of things that they've done, and confident, strong, stable leaders don't do those things. Scared leaders do those things. So that is significant. Sisi did an interview on CBS News I guess this was about a year ago. Don't ask me why he agreed to do an interview on 60 Minutes. I mean, it's an absurd. Yeah. I'm not an advisor to authoritarian governments, but if I was, I would not advise him to go on 60 Minutes. But it was a disaster. I don't know if you watched the interview, but it was a disaster. The man is sweating. It was horrible. And then after the interview, the Egyptian regime called CBS on the telephone and said, we don't want you to air the interview. They don't understand how it works. They don't understand. So they're learning about the limits of their power. They can control public opinion. They can manufacture opinion polling data and prevent Western governments from, or Western, I should say, polling organizations like Pew and Zogby from going into Egypt and carrying out polls. They can do that. They can manufacture opinion polling results, but they can't control what goes on outside of Egypt. And so they're learning important lessons, the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the Emiratis, about the limits of their power.
Okay, thank you. This question is from Dan Lieberman, alternativeinsight.com. Do economic wants, it's not directed to any specific person, do economic wants come before political imperatives? If so, was the Arab Spring doomed to fail because it could not quickly satisfy economic wants?
Who is this for?
Who's the, anybody?
Can I mention?
Who's the economist here?
It's clear from the modern history of the Arab world that basic human needs, socioeconomic, life-sustaining needs, come before political issues: water, housing, education, healthcare, food. And so people in the Arab countries, as they did in many other countries in East Asia, would sacrifice political rights for basic quality of life issues. And this is why in the Arab world, from the 1930s till recently, we didn't have huge popular uprisings against the internal government. There was one or two against Numairi in Sudan. You had some in Iraq against Saddam because of the Kurdish and Shia repression. They rebelled against him. But broadly speaking, the kind of revolutionary street uprisings that we've seen in the last 8 years in the Arab world are a new phenomenon in terms of being directed internally. And that's because in all the previous 70 or 80 years of Arab national development, most Arab families felt that their lives were improving and their kids were going to have better lives as well. That stopped around 1990 or so, and that's why you've seen a lot of these internal issues. So I think it's very clear that people basically just want to be treated as human beings with basic rights and opportunities, not to be constrained in what they can speak or read or travel, and they're not, most people are not particularly ideological. They just want to live a normal, decent life. But when their government constrains them and treats them like animals, they push back. But so I would say clearly that socioeconomic needs are a priority for all human beings over political issues. But there's a point, and the World Bank and others did studies from the East Asian experience, that why did South Korea and Taiwan and Malaysia and Indonesia and all these people put up with authoritarian, autocratic regimes for so many years without pushing back? And they found that basically there was a combination of reasons, but one of them was that basic human needs came first. But when people reached a certain level where their needs were satisfied, basic human needs, and that came with about a per capita GDP of around $6,000 back then. Once people reached that level that their needs were met, then they started asking for political rights. And this is it's a universal human reality, I think.
Very briefly, sorry.
Ladies first.
Very briefly, I'm not an economist with any stretch of imagination, but I just have a yes and no answer to Ahmad's question, because really what we saw in the Arab Spring was the slogan, عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, bread, freedom, and social justice, right? So a lot of people wrote at the time saying, oh, whoever thinks that the Arab Spring is just about bread, it's just about food, just about, the economy, they're mistaken, because people also want dignity. People want social justice. People want to be heard. They want to be respected. They want to be recognized. And all of these are also equally important needs that need to be acknowledged and taken into consideration. So we don't want to, overstate or understate the importance of the economy and importance of socioeconomic needs, which are, as Rami just explained, are very important and very vital to every society and every human being, not just quote-unquote Arab societies or Arabs. But we also don't want to overshadow or underestimate the importance of other valid and legitimate demands for justice, for dignity, for freedom, and for respect.
Good.
Can I just chime in really quickly? So one of the reasons why, as Sahar is alluding to, one of the reasons why Arabs went out into the street in 2010 and 2011 was for economic reasons. They knew that if they could bring about a political change, that their economic fortunes would change for the better, right? And one of the, I'm not an economist, but I know a lot of economists, and they've taught me that authoritarianism breeds corruption, okay? And so it's no surprise that in the Arab region we find some of the most politically repressive authoritarian governments in the world, and also we find some of the most prolific violators of the just basic economic norms in the world, the highest levels of corruption in the world, in the Arab region. If you look at things like the corruption perception index, right? So if the political landscape changes, then the wealth can be more easily, more fairly distributed. We talk about the wealth gap in the United States. Look at the wealth gap in a place like Egypt. It's massive. I've never seen so many Mercedes-Benzes in my life as I have in Cairo, and I've never seen so many people living in the streets, living in the graveyards, eating out of the garbage as I have in Cairo.
Can I just add?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I would just agree with that. I think it's a fallacy that you can separate these things out, right? The economic systems and the political systems are inextricably connected in these countries and in all countries. And so in terms of thinking about solutions, you can't change the economic situation of people until you address the political system too.
Thank you. I think we're coming close to the end here, but I do want to ask this question to Sahar Khamis from Dr. Ghassan Boudiab. How do you see the upcoming juncture in Lebanon given the current protests, and what do you say about the coverage the Lebanese TV channels are doing?
I think that any observer of Lebanon, in my opinion, my own, every human being has their own subjectivity, but I'm very impressed with what the Lebanese people are doing. I'm very impressed with the mobilization on the street. I'm very impressed with the overall, international attention that has been paid to Lebanon and to the mobilization of people on the street. And one only hopes that with such movements as we are seeing in Lebanon, in Algeria, in Sudan, in Iraq, these kind of protests on the street and this kind of public mobilization will have a trickle-down effect to other post-Arab Spring countries that did not have a fortunate outcome, as I mentioned earlier, with the exception of Tunisia. Because I have the mic, let me just very quickly say something which is very important, I did not mention in my talk, which is really one of the most important limitations of the role of media and the role of social media in particular, is they cannot fill the power vacuum. If you have a power vacuum in a society that's not filled with actual civic engagement and on-the-street activism, social media cannot be magic. It's not a magical tool. It will not be able to fill this kind of vacuum. It's easy to oust a dictator from office. It's very difficult to figure out what to do next. And we learned this lesson the hard way, just observing what happened, the detours and the reversals and the backlashes and setbacks in the so-called post-Arab Spring countries. The social media was not able to fill some of these power vacuums or to fill some of these gaps. It was not able to create, quote-unquote, actual civic engagement, meaning actual engagement in organizations, NGOs, political parties. These need an overall socioeconomic and political structure and transformation in societies, and it cannot create a sufficient trickle-down effect if you have the absence of public opinion leaders, as we have seen in the limited protests that took place in Egypt last month, September 2019, the fact that the government acted very quickly to arrest more than 3,000 people, many of whom are activists, bloggers, human rights activists, journalists, you name it, across the board. The fact that these public opinion leaders are either behind bar, in jail, in exile, or killed, or forcibly disappeared, means that you cannot have a sufficient trickle-down effect to actually create a sufficient mass mobilization. So I hope that the experience of Lebanon and other countries that are witnessing these waves of change and protest now will kind of really learn the lesson and fill some of these gaps to create a successful example that other countries can emulate.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for very, very nice, for attending a very, very nice panel. Really, we had a lot of thoughts here, and this is a very, very good introduction to the lunch conversation that is silencing the truth, the case of Jamal Khashoggi. and 2 other panels in the afternoon. Please join us for lunch next door, and thank you very much for being here.